Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Helle, and thanks for being with us. In March 2025, President Donald Trump issued an executive order designating English as the official language of the United States. This was one of 109 executive orders issued in the first 3 months of his administration. Now, prior to the order being signed, 30 states already had English as their official language. 12 of those states had done so through the initiative referendum process, something we're very familiar with here at Ballotpedia. And one more, Idaho, is considering doing so in 2026. Now, that's a long time from now, but considering the larger context around the story and all the history we have on ballot measures here at Ballotpedia, we thought this would be a fun episode to check in on where things stand in Idaho and look back at similar ballot measures from the past that we can learn from. We'll get to that history in the second half of our show with our very own Ryan Byrne, but first I'm joined by the Idaho Capital Sun's Kyle Pfannenstiel, one of their reporters covering state politics. Kyle, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this proposed constitutional amendment. It just got approved to be on the ballot. So tell us a little bit about what was the campaign like to get that on the ballot? How did that come to be in Idaho?
So this was a pretty quick process to approve the proposed constitutional amendment, and lawmakers behind the push, they said a few things. They say this, simply reflects what Idaho's already doing. To some extent, this is already an Idaho law. And they say it highlights the importance of language. Supporters also reference President Donald Trump's executive order declaring English as the United States official language. And Idaho lawmakers also talked about how learning English is part of the naturalization process for immigrants to get citizenship. So the legislature proposed this amendment by passing House Joint Resolution 6 this year. It was sponsored by a mix of Republican lawmakers, including the House Speaker. And I think it's worth backing up a little bit. This proposed amendment comes on the heels of another successful constitutional amendment in Idaho. That amendment, it passed in November 2024, and it explicitly bans non-citizens from voting in Idaho elections.
Mm-hmm.
Citizenship was already required to vote in Idaho, but this is meant to add more clarity to what's in the Constitution and to stop any local governments from potentially letting non-citizens vote locally.
Right. And so, the point you're making is that this is one of those situations, and we see this a lot in the ballot measure landscape where sometimes you have something that's already a statute, it's already a law, and lawmakers or citizens through the initiative process will decide they want to actually embed it in the Constitution itself. And that's essentially what's happening here. Now, was this bipartisan or was it split along party lines?
I guess, there were a couple Democrats who voted for the bill. One of them told me it was a mistake on his part. He pressed the wrong button
Oh,
on the floor, and by the time he realized it, he couldn't change his vote.
does that happen often?
But not that I've seen. He said that he got a kind of phone call that took his attention away while he was voting, and he talked me through afterwards why he opposed the bill. Why he would have opposed the bill. But
Seems like one of those interesting things that, are over here in Ballotpedia land, and, there's all these intricate, complex details of the American political system, and the idea that a lawmaker could, accidentally push the wrong button. This seems interesting in our electronic day and age, but yeah, I mean, I suppose it could happen, right? There's hundreds of thousands of bills and probably millions of votes if you tally up all the different, bill stages and procedural votes and whatnot. So numerically speaking, the odds are that it happens at times. So, well, anyway, okay, so great. So yeah, so that was an interesting story behind how this came to pass, and this will be on the 2026 ballot, I believe, right? Yep. So how does the process for constitutional amendments work in Idaho? We talk about that a little bit on the show, but just sort of walk our listeners through it. Do they need multiple sessions? Can it happen pretty quickly? What does that sort of look like?
this happened pretty quickly. I think it was in a matter of a month or two that the resolution was introduced and then passed both chambers of the legislature. And I knew that some states have a process where citizens propose their own ballot initiatives. Idaho's not that way. Only the state legislature can propose amendments to the Constitution. It has to be approved by voters to pass. So to qualify, proposed amendments need two-thirds support in the legislature's two chambers, the House and Senate. And once they do qualify for the ballot to pass, they only need a simple majority of support from voters. And and also this comes a little later. I'm not sure when this will happen because there's a big period between the legislature passing this proposed constitutional amendment and and the electors voting on it. But
Yep.
as part of the process in Idaho, Idaho lawmakers, last time it was Idaho legislative leaders, it's a committee of leaders, they finalize arguments in support and against the constitutional amendment, and that is distributed to voters through an official pamphlet in the mail.
So it's a long way off from now. Sometimes there are ballot measures that are put on a ballot, like, in spring of an odd year or even in the November odd year, or sometimes the ballot measure gets, passed through a session and then appears before voters in, say, the subsequent spring primary. In this case, it'll be November 26th. What are you hearing from, citizens right now? Obviously, it's a long way off this vote. And to your point, the supporting and opposing arguments are still probably being, crafted and they'll be distributed at a later date. But what are you hearing from your reporting about this measure?
Yeah, so this sailed through the legislature pretty quickly without much pushback. I didn't see any members of the public testify in committee on the bill, either for or against it. So I don't know how citizens more broadly are feeling about this proposed amendment. I guess I could talk through a bit of concerns in the session and reasons that one Democrat voted for it. So one Democrat, he's Senator James Ruckty from Pocatello. He told me he supported it because he saw it basically just acknowledging what Idaho already does, and he didn't see the amendment as restricting other languages being used in state government. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that later. But the Democratic leader in the Senate, Senator Melissa Wintrow from Boise, she opposed it. She called it a waste of taxpayer dollars, and she said it's pretty clear that English is Idaho's official language already. And then there was the Democrat in the House who told me he voted on accident for it. He said he worries about the amendment would do a few different things, but one of it would require English be used in public instruction. That language worries him because he worries about people who can't speak English. He says they have to learn in their native language before they become proficient in English.
Yeah. So are there any kind of enforcement mechanisms that are put into this? That's one thing we've sort of noticed over the years with these kinds of ballot measures is sometimes they're sort of, symbolic, so to speak, where, just puts some language into the Constitution that says, English is the official language of the state. In other cases, there's more specific language that specifically has, enforcement mechanisms for the state to use. Like, well, how do you, so for instance, how would the state of Idaho enforce that English be the primary language used in education? Is that something that's been clear yet, or is that more like it would be a regulation down the road?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know how this would be enforced. I know that, I mean, generally, the legislature has a few way to enforce things. Like, there's been some pretty big shakeups in our legislature's budget committee. It's a joint committee of the House and Senate, and they've taken up this practice a lot more recently, of where they pass budget intent language that's kind of directing state agencies how they're supposed to spend funds, or conditions upon approving funds, like eliminating diversity and equity programs in certain agencies. Or I covered this big complicated investigation into like how the state health department doled out childcare grants, and so I don't know the specific ways they enforce this off the top of my head, but I think the legislature generally has quite a few tools.
Well, it's something that, we've been covering quite a bit in the last year or so about Ballotpedia is that typically people think when a legislation is passed or a constitution is changed that that's kind of like the end point. But really, there's something that comes after that, and that's the regulations. Those have a significant impact on how, education policy is enacted or around, pension policy, energy policy, anything else. It's not just what the legislature says; it comes beyond that. So we see that a lot in ballot measures, which is one of the reasons why there's something called legislative alterations, where an initiative can get passed and the legislature can come back the following year and tweak it. So in some states, not all states, but what else is on Idaho's radar this year? I'm sure you have your hands very deep in Idaho's legislature and you're deep within the committee ongoing. So what else is going on in Idaho?
Oh, there's always a lot. So I guess the bills fiscal note says on this amendment it could cost like $300,000 to pursue putting this on the ballot. And it would be for like a range of different costs, like finalizing the arguments for those pamphlets are going to cost money and stuff. But it's not going to be the only thing that's on the ballot. So it's not clear if that 300,000 would be just a loan for this. So there's one other thing confirmed going to be on the November 2026 ballot in Idaho, and there's two other things that could be. So the legislature also passed another proposed constitutional amendment this year. It asks voters to make it so only the Idaho legislature has the power to legalize marijuana and other narcotics. If passed, that amendment would basically eliminate the power of Idaho voters to potentially legalize marijuana through a citizens ballot initiative. We're still waiting to see if two other ballot initiatives could qualify for the 2026 ballot. Waiting to see if they get enough support signatures to qualify for the ballot. There are constitutional thresholds for that. One of them would be an abortion rights ballot initiative. It would establish abortion exceptions for emergencies, fetal viability, and other reproductive health protections. And another could be a marijuana decriminalization ballot initiative. So Idaho is one of a few states that doesn't have marijuana legalized in any form, medicinal or recreational. That's different from a lot of the surrounding states to Idaho. But it's worth mentioning that attempts to legalize marijuana in Idaho have failed several times over the past decade, either in the legislature or through ballot initiatives.
Well, yeah, those are several topics that have come up quite a bit nationally in other states over the years, including in Florida last year, where the marijuana legalization measure failed with more than $100 million spent in that campaign. So two topics that probably will get quite a bit of national attention if they do make the ballot in November 2026. So great. Thank you so much, Kyle, for coming on the show today and bringing us this perspective about what's going on in Idaho, because we here at Ballotpedia love to bring our listener stories about the various ongoings within our 50 states and our federal democracy. So great to have you on, Kyle. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
I'm joined now by Ballotpedia's Ryan Byrne, a regular on the show and one of our experts on ballot measures, to help us walk through some of the other English as official language measures we've seen over the last 40 years and what we can learn from them and how voters weighed in on them at the time. So, Ryan, welcome back as always. Great to see you.
All right. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
We actually got to see each other in person a few weeks back, so that was pretty great. I don't think the bowling night turned out to be too effective, though. I think we know ballot measures better than bowling at this point in time.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. I left that to my team to handle, and they did all right.
We all did the best we could. So, but let's talk about a different B word, ballot measures, not bowling. So 30 states, as I mentioned in the intro, already have English as official language on the books. So that makes it more than just sort of a Republican focus. For instance, California has English as its official language. Texas does not, for example. So what's some of the history behind this? What got people interested in making English the official language in state law or constitution in the first place? Where did that push come from in the 1980s?
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right. It's interesting to look at a map of this issue. California adopted English as its official language in 1986 via a ballot measure with fairly broad approval. Texas was never enacted a similar law. So the push for official language definitely gained momentum in the 1980s. It was a period of increased immigration. There were kind of a lot of ongoing debates at the federal level about language education and public services. And there were advocacy groups, organizations, just like we see right now around various issues. There's one in particular called U.S. English that definitely promoted the idea, especially through ballot measures. And during this period, and it's kind of very similar arguments to what we see today, supporters often emphasize the value of a common language, both symbolically and practically, while, critics raised concerns about how that could affect access to services, education, and other legal issues. And during this period, we got some important ballot measures and court rulings out of it, such as one in Arizona that really reflected this debate and how far these laws could go or should be interpreted.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the California measure was passed through broad support. So what was the actual vote percentage that won by in 86?
Yeah, so in 1986, when voters passed it, it was 73%, which is actually pretty high for a ballot initiative. It was citizen initiated. Especially in California, it's a pretty high margin.
It's pretty rare for initiatives to win by that large of a margin. The phrasing common language is kind of an interesting one, because if you're reading a lot of science fiction books, usually they say things like oh, so and so speaks the common tongue or the common, language. It's kind of a fairly common, I know, we're buzzwording here, terminology, so to speak. So tell us a little more about some of the big moments or court cases like this Arizona situation that changed how states handle official language laws.
Yeah, so this case in Arizona, I think really, set the framework for how these laws tend to be written and implemented. Arizona in 1988, voters passed Proposition 106. Now, very interestingly, this one had the narrowest margin, less than 1%, which, with the rest of these passing by large margins, probably suggests, something may have set this one apart from others. So, Prop 106 declared English to be the official state language, but it also required most government business to be conducted in English and allowed any resident to sue to enforce this policy. So, yeah, what made it especially notable relative to the other ballot measures is that it went beyond designating English as the official language to include like specific restrictions and legal enforceability. That actually led to a court challenge, and in 1998, the Arizona Supreme Court unanimously struck it down, finding that it violated the federal constitution um, due to its disproportionate impact on non-English speaking residents. So, this wasn't a federal ruling; it was a state ruling. But I think the decision addressed certain constitutional limits on official English laws, or at least it's the way other states have kind of interpreted that, and they've avoided as strict of laws. So again, the court case centered less on designating English as the official language and more on what that designation actually requires or doesn't require.
Hmm.
So I think, for example, Arizona, we'll come back to Arizona. So that one was in 1988. In 2006, Arizonans revisited the issue with Proposition 103. Proposition 103 made English the official language, but this one was more narrowly written. It emphasized, the state promoting English in official functions, but did not require it in all business. So it still allowed unofficial multilingual communication. And this one passed with 74% of the vote.
Okay. So, what kind of an impact do these English as an official language laws have on, say, education? Does it change anything in school systems and how schools are run typically, or is it sort of you know, just a law in name only, so to speak, without much enforcement or practical changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, I think it depends on how like the ballot measure or law is written and how broad it is. So a lot of these states, so even looking at California, that one didn't kind of like explicitly require, or at least it wasn't interpreted to require some kind of educational mandate. But voters later passed another ballot measure about bilingual education and various restrictions on it. So again, it kind of just depends on like how much you're putting in a ballot measure or what it's been written to do, or courts get involved, what it's been interpreted to do. So yeah, that's kind of up in the air in terms of like, well, it depends on how it's written. I know that's kind of a cheating answer, but
No, so it's the classic, that's the American political system, right? You have, laws are written by the legislative entity, then you have, the federal or executive authority to enact and execute and, regulations off of the law. Right. Judicial branch is going to then adjudicate on it. This is literally checks and balances in action. The founders are, cheering from their grave. That's exactly how they designed this to play out. Just really just depends on the state and depends on what's going on. So, let's talk about the new executive order from President Trump then. So he signed that in March. How does that compare to the statewide ballot measures we've seen? What effect did the new executive order from President Trump have on states and their own policies?
right, that's a good question. So, how it compares, I mean, it designates English as the official language of the federal government, and it kind of states that. Beyond that, kind of like the only perhaps major practical provision is that it rescinded a previous executive order requiring agencies to improve availability or access regarding limited English proficiency programs. So the new order allows agency heads to decide whether to continue those services, but doesn't necessarily ban them or change existing legal frameworks under federal law, because there are lots of federal laws, and those are things that still affect the states regardless of these ballot measures. Um, the order itself doesn't really require states to do anything. It doesn't require them to adopt any changes to their language policies or programs. That said, as we learned in Idaho, the order may influence state level legislation as, states and federal government often do influence each other, at least kind of on that level of prominent issues. Things arise from the states, get addressed by Congress. Maybe Congress or the president is issuing an executive order. It may inspire some people to do something. So in Idaho, proponents actually cited the federal order and didn't even introduce their constitutional amendment until after the federal order was issued, kind of as support for a state constitutional amendment designating English as the official language.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you kind of alluded to this already, but so are there other examples where when a state makes a change like this, where does that have any changes to how government services are delivered? And again, you've kind of touched this already, but are there other examples that come to mind, or other sort of just general principles that we've seen?
Right. I do think, kind of as I was saying earlier, one way to think of this and to like break it down a little bit more clearly, I think, is that some laws are symbolic or social or cultural, you could say, whatever term you prefer, in which they kind of declare English to be the official language without really changing existing practices. And that's the majority of them. Others have had some restrictions limiting some government communications to English. For example, Arizona is obviously the big one, but this Idaho constitutional amendment would actually state that English should be used in public proceedings and public documents and public instruction. Doesn't necessarily say in providing public services, and there's probably a reason for that, given Arizona. But federal law, there are a number of federal laws that continue to require, multilingual access to certain services and voting, education, employment, those types of areas. So those requirements remain in place regardless of state level official language laws.
You kind of touched this already as well, but let's get into the future here. So we know that Idaho is considering taking this up. What other states might take this up via ballot measure over the next few years? Are there any sort of, indications we have of states that might want to tackle this issue?
There's a few things we can look at, but currently I'd actually say not really, only because it's been addressed by many states already. There doesn't appear to be an organized movement to advance official English language measures. When I say official movement or organized movement, I'm referring to it's kind of ballot measure words. I'm not saying there isn't a group of people who don't support it, but like,
Right.
funders, campaigns, those types of things. Idaho remains the only state with a measure scheduled for its ballot now. But again, its proposal was introduced shortly after a federal executive order declaring English the official language, which supporters cited as a motivating factor. And there are a few other states without such laws that are Republican trifectas, Texas, Louisiana, and Ohio. So, if there was a place where legislators wanted to put it on the ballot, those seem like the most likely. Or even if they just wanted to pass a law that's statutory that doesn't need to go on the ballot. So yeah, while Idaho is the only state with a measure currently on the ballot, national developments like the recent executive order could, spark renewed interest. But for now, there's not really a clear sign of a broader state level push.
One thing it makes me wonder about is whether or not, and I don't know if this has happened before, but has there been any push from Democratic Party groups or aligned groups to some of those existing states that have this on the books, for instance, California, right? Would there be a push to get rid of an existing state law? Have we seen anything like that?
I don't think so. And I think it's primarily, again, due to these kind of having a more symbolic or cultural effect instead of like having a ton of practical effects. Like I said, there are other English language ballot measures out there that aren't necessarily about official language, like ones that are specifically about education. There was one in California kind of during this similar period that the legislature actually did address again in I believe it was 2016, to actually repeal a ballot measure to require English in public schools, effectively ending a bilingual education. And voters did vote, again, 73% to get rid of that 1998 ballot measure, which they did originally approve of 62%. So yeah, I do think there's definitely interest in repealing some laws limiting actions specifically to English, but not necessarily on the designating an official language front.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how this all transpires over the coming year or two ahead, and whether or not this becomes one of those other sort of new niche topic spaces in the ballot measure landscape, or if these are sort of isolated instances. So always great to talk ballot measures with you, Ryan. Thanks as always for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Powlett, and thanks for listening.